In case you haven't been here the past couple of weeks, the gospel that we heard this morning is the third in a series of some of the more difficult teachings of Jesus. Now, Jesus is moving closer and closer to the cross in this part of Matthew's gospel, and he's getting more serious about his message and about this judgment that he's leveling against the leaders of Israel. His message is the kingdom of heaven is here now, that God is in your midst, and that Israel's been given a choice to turn to God and live. In our story today, we hear about a king who throws a big wedding banquet for his son, but none of the guests come. They are too busy doing other things, and some even respond in anger and rage, killing the king's servants. The king returns the violence by destroying them and their city, and then the king tells his servants to invite anyone they can find, good and bad alike, to come to the banquet. Now, this story sounds a lot like what we heard last week. We have another allegory, the king representing God, the servants represent the prophets, and the guests who don't come are the people who have turned away from God throughout the whole history of Israel. And while the guests who do come are the ones who are turning toward God, and most likely also Gentiles. However, at the end of today's story, there's a new twist that we haven't heard in the other two parables. While everyone is having a good time, the king comes in and sees one man who is dressed inappropriately. And after the merriment of the wedding banquet, it's a shock to hear the way the king approaches him, and then throws him out into outer darkness, all because of how he was dressed. Now, of course, the issue is really not what the man is wearing. The issue is that the man has counted himself among the guests without giving himself wholly to the party. He did not bring his robe, or to look at it from that allegorical perspective and theological language, he has not fully embraced his turning toward God. He is enjoying the grace of God in this wonderful banquet without living a life of grace. In the life of any faithful Christian, there is a tension between what we have come to call faith and works. There are lots of ways that we can define faith, but basically it's trusting in the promises of God in Jesus, that we are forgiven, loved, and accepted exactly as we are. Works, on the other hand, suggest a response to the grace that we've been given in faith. It's what we do with our lives after we turn to God. Faith and works are not one-time happenings either. There are many moments in each day when we have opportunity to experience faith, and other moments when we have opportunity to live out our faith and how we behave, what we do in response to this faith that we've been given. So some Christians say that only faith is necessary for salvation. Others say you must have works, that you must show your faith in order to be saved. And then there's another group of Christians who say that it's a combination and a relationship between faith and works. One gives way to the other and can only be complete if the other is present. If we have faith only and then go around behaving badly in a manner that is not reflective of who we are as Christians, it belies our faith. If our works are without faith undergirding what we do, then the work is empty. It's not grace-filled, and it's not grace-giving. It's just work. In his book, The Cost of Discipleship, German pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer addresses this age-old question of the tension between faith and works in a most insightful way. Bonhoeffer contrasts two different kinds of grace, cheap grace and costly grace. Here's what Bonhoeffer says of cheap grace. Cheap grace is preaching forgiveness without requiring repentance. Baptism without church discipline. Communion without confession. Grace without Jesus Christ, living and incarnate. Grace without discipleship. Grace without the cross. Now, can you hear the emptiness in this description of cheap grace? To be forgiven without being repentant? Or to be baptized into a faith community without actually participating in the life of that community? Or to call oneself a Christian without being a disciple of Christ, without following the way of Jesus, which is a way that is love and compassion, and working at being that same love and compassion in the world. Now, that's cheap grace when we don't do those things. The way of Jesus, Bonhoeffer says, is costly grace. And here's what he means by costly grace. Costly grace is the treasure hidden in the field. For the sake of it, a man will gladly go and sell all that he has. It is the pearl of great price, to buy which the merchant will sell all his goods. It is the call of Jesus Christ, at which the disciple leaves his nets and follows him. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow, and it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life, and it is grace because it gives a man the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly because it cost God the life of his Son. Above all, it is grace because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price to pay for our life, but delivered him up for us. The wedding guest without the proper attire is a man who is striving after cheap grace. The king sees it and removes him from the banquet. The banquet has been prepared for those who are choosing to strive after a life of integrity, and the tension between the faith they have received and the call to act on that faith. It is for those who have chosen the way of costly grace. What's most curious about this story is perhaps what happens to the man who is tossed out by the king, thrown into outer darkness. It would be easy for us to dismiss this parable and to dismiss God in it by seeing that God has rejected this man and been the one to choose a bad end for him. But really, the man has already chosen the pain and separation and darkness for himself when he chose cheap grace. Cheap grace keeps us separate from the richness of God, from the true life waiting for us. Cheap grace keeps us in the darkness and away from the light of Christ, which we find when we follow the way of Jesus, this way of love and compassion. I have been speaking about these two different types of grace in very dichotomous terms, as if it was one or the other that we make a choice for in our life. But the fact of the matter is that we all choose cheap grace sometimes, and costly grace at other times. A mature spirituality might begin to tip the scales more toward costly grace, more toward choosing the way of love and compassion, honesty and integrity, regardless of what the perceived outcome may be. Making this choice not out of protecting ourselves, but out of love for Jesus. It takes practice, but the good news